Constrained by the ideological concerns of their times, composers often struggle to fully articulate their social critiques. Modern composers, thus, reframe these narratives, dismantling and reconstructing the timeless ideas of these works through contemporary lenses to strike deeper resonance with new audiences. Shakespeare's The Tempest, 1611, and Atwood's Hagseed, 2016, engage in a textual dialogue that transcends mimesis and catalyzes the potential for theater and language to either perpetuate oppressive social realities or incite self-discovery. Shakespeare's Christian humanist values, shaped by a Jacobean worldview, tie identity, moral transformation, and power to a divine order and providential justice. In contrast, Atwood, writing in a secular, postmodern context, reframes these ideas for contemporary audiences by emphasizing the importance of psychological rehabilitation in achieving both personal and collective transformation, restoring one's sense of self. Both works interrogate theater and language as sites of and catalysts for either exploitation or transformation, and the ongoing struggle for self-definition within enduringly oppressive master narratives. Reflecting the ideological transition from the medieval era to the Renaissance, Shakespeare initiates a cultural dialogue on how language and narratives paradoxically operate as instruments of oppressive determinism for marginalized identities, or as potential conduits for agency and change. Shakespeare's Renaissance context, embedded in the Age of Discovery, subordinates the colonial other as justification for imperial superiority, as evidenced by Prospero's dominion over Caliban. Caliban is characterized as an aberration, where the dehumanizing rhetoric in the extract, "Thou poisonous slave, got by the devil himself," affirms that his identity is dictated by Prospero's imposed narrative.
Yet Shakespeare subtly questions the linguistic determinism of this colonial master narrative, as Caliban is imbued with an aesthetic sensibility and nuance when lamenting, "The isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs," conveying the gentleness in Caliban's demeanor, subverting his otherwise crude and monstrous portrayal, thus granting him lyrical introspection that subverts the archetype of the subhuman other, aligning with Montaigne's Renaissance conception of the noble savage.
However, this moment of subversion is ultimately subsumed through Caliban's subsequent descent into the violent diction, "batter his skull" or "punch with a stake," demonstrating his entrapment within the contextual master narratives of Shakespeare's time and reinforcing linguistic determinism as Caliban conforms to the literary archetype of the uncivilized, violent other.
The Tempest thus highlights how rigid language and social structures restrict change, showing that transformations are limited when power and status are framed as divinely ordained.
Atwood reframes this discourse on marginalization through a postmodern critique of modern institutional oppression, asserting language as a means for the marginalized to engender collective solidarity and assert self-identity, rather than solely a vehicle of subjugation.
In recasting Shakespeare's island as a Canadian prison, Atwood intentionally critiques modern systemic incarceration and rehabilitation in perpetuating recidivism and reinforcing deterministic cycles of racial and socio-cultural marginalization.
Caliban is appropriated through the collective prison inmates to reflect Atwood's post-colonial context that critiques punitive tools of social control. The truncated sentences within Tim Ease's rap, gibbering lunatics, street people, addicts, dregs of society, creates a staccato rhythm that dehumanizes and reduces people to blunt labels, illuminating his shrewd cognizance of the enduring social stratification and dehumanization of the marginalized, while granting agency and authority to the form of rap, traditionally subordinated as a lowbrow form of culture.
Yet, where Shakespeare's Caliban remains ensnared in his linguistic marginalization, Atwood asserts literacy and language as tools for agency, evidenced in the collective deixis of the inmates. We get him, as they identify with Caliban's plight and gain ownership over the narrative. Subsequently, the titular motif and refrain, "But I'm Hagseed," subverts Caliban's derogatory epithet and transforms it into an emblem of resilience that fosters community among the inmates. Atwood modernizes Shakespeare's critique of linguistic control and colonial narratives, emphasizing self-definition over fate and reinforcing theatre and language as tools of resistance.
Within The Tempest, Shakespeare initiates a profoundly modern inquiry into theater as a metaphorical instrumental of control and mimesis that catalyzes moral transformation, resonating with the playwright's Christian humanist values that galvanized the ecclesiastical virtues of mercy, moderation, and redemption.
In his initial role as malevolent director of the island's fate, Prospero manipulates performance and appearances to facilitate his quest for vengeance, whereby the Tempest functions as both a literal and symbolic upheaval. The titular motif of the tempestuous noise of thunder and lightning heard symbolically posits the tempest literally and symbolically, reflecting Porpsero's orchestration of events and his control over the island. Thus, by confining all action to one space, Shakespeare utilizes Aristotelian unities to emphasize theatrical and narrative control, with his indifferent tone in declaring no harm done, further reinforcing his desensitization to the moral implications of his own theatrical spectacle.
Shakespeare shows that Prospero's obsession with the artifice of performance blinds him morally, compelling him to manipulate characters and events with magic, rather than allowing them to follow their expected trajectory or flow of events, thereby subverting natural order. This is exemplified in his metaphorical assertion that mine enemies are all knitted up, which unveils Prospero dehumanizing objectification of his adversaries as mere puppets in his grand design. Yet, Shakespeare does not allow his protagonist to remain ensnared within this illusion of control. Hence, Prospero's epiphany, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on," signals a dissolution of the boundary between director and performer as he comes to reflect upon his theatrically imposed delusions and, by extension, his own humanity. Consequently, his final soliloquy functions as both a plea to the audience and a relinquishment of absolute control. "My charms are all overthrown. Let your indulgence set me free," breaking of the fourth wall, inviting the viewers as active participants in the story, thus encouraging them to consider the questions the text raises, foregrounding Shakespeare's proposition that theatre's ultimate purpose is not dominance, but catharsis.
Shakespeare thus posits theater as transformative but bound by divine justice and providential reconciliation through Prospero's arc.
While Shakespeare frames theater as a moral crucible shaped by Christian humanist ideals of self-awareness, Atwood reconfigures the metaphor for a secular context, presenting performance as a vehicle for psychological rehabilitation and self-discovery.
The characterization of a vengeful, callous Felix mirrors Prospero's dramatic quality of malevolence as both characters transform through theatrical art, yet where the latter's transformation is informed by Christian absolution, Felix's is rooted in psychological healing.
Felix's unresolved grief manifests in his obsessive resurrection of Miranda, conveyed through the asyndetic lament, "Couldn't have her in life, but he could catch sight of her through his art. Just a glimpse." The symbolism of art as a palimpsest for Miranda's memory underscores Felix's entrapment in a self-imposed, futile performance that perpetuates his grief, paralleling Prospero's entanglement in revenge.
Atwood thus resonates with Shakespeare's timeless critique of vengeance as devoid of true fulfillment, as Felix's rhetorical question, "Why does it feel like a letdown?" exposes the fallacy of his vendetta, compelling him to seek a more profound transformation of his morality.
Atwood reinterprets theater as a tool for personal catharsis rather than divine justice. The tricolon, "What to do with such sorrow?" noting he could put into language, he had to transform it, mirrors Prospero's release of Miranda in To the Elements. Be free, reframing it as a moment of self-discovery, This secular humanist perspective highlights theatre's role in processing grief and achieving self-actualization. By reconfiguring Shakespeare's meta-theatrical inquiry, Atwood modernizes theatre's purpose, emphasizing psychological rehabilitation over divine reckoning.